Salve, ladies. So today we are going to be learning chapter 17 in Wheelock's Latin. So we're going to learn about the relative pronoun and the relative clause. Okay, first thing you need to know, main clause versus subordinate clause. A main clause is any part of the sentence that has its own distinct verb. Okay, that's what a clause is. The main clause can function as a main sentence, right? It has all the trappings of a main sentence. A subordinate clause has to hang off of a main clause, right? So a main clause can exist on its own, a subordinate clause cannot. One type of subordinate clause is called the relative clause. And a relative clause is a subordinate clause that has a relative pronoun and a verb. Okay, so introduced by a relative pronoun and it has a verb. That's all a relative clause is. Okay, relative pronouns translate into English as who, whose, whom, which, what, depending on the gender and the case of the pronoun. For the most part, it's the gender of the case in Latin, but not necessarily, because sometimes there are things in Latin that are, say, masculine that we would consider more neuter. So keep that in mind. A relative clause has a relative pronoun and a verb, but it can have a subject or a direct object or an indirect object or an ablative use or something like that. The purpose of a relative clause is to give more information about a noun or a pronoun in the main clause. And that noun or pronoun is called the antecedent. Now, you need to know the antecedent to a relative pronoun. And the reason for that is because the relative pronoun is going to get its gender and its number from its antecedent. It's going to get its case from how it functions in the relative clause, but gender and number from the antecedent. Also, you're going to want to translate your relative clause immediately after its antecedent because that's what it's giving more information about. So you have to be able to identify the antecedent. Gender and number from the antecedent, case from how it's functioning in the relative clause. What that means is if the pronoun is the subject of the relative clause, then it's going to be in the nominative. If it is possessive, it's going to be in the genitive. If it's an indirect object, it's going to be in the dative. If it's the direct object, it's going to be in the accusative. It can also be one of the ablative uses. So you can see any of those uses of a relative pronoun. Okay? Now, first things first, you have to actually learn the relative pronouns, right? You have to know what the chart is, okay? So in some ways, this is very similar to other pronouns, right? Especially in the IUS ending in the genitive and the I ending in the dative. And then going back to a more regularized declension. However, relative pronouns are a little bit more irregular than that in that they have some endings that are very first, second declension, some endings that are very third declension. So you just have to memorize the forms so you know what gender, number, case any given relative pronoun is, okay? So in the singular, qui, quai, quod, cuius, 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 qui, qui, quem, quam, quad, quo, qua, quo, qui, quai, quai in the plural, quorum, quarum, quorum, quibus, 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 quos, quas, quae, quibus, quibus, quibus. And again, especially in the plural, you can see some first, second declension endings, some third. Okay, once you know how to form the pronoun, we can move on to how to translate them and the relative clause. In English, we use the word who if the relative pronoun is the subject, and whom if it's the object, direct object, indirect object, object of a preposition, any of that, it's whom. We use whose to show possession. So if you guys have ever been confused about the difference between who and whom, it's fairly easy. Who is a subject, or a nominative, if you will. Whom is the object be that direct object, accusative, indirect object, dative, or object of various prepositions, ablative or accusative, okay? We use which when the antecedent is neuter. Again, remember that Latin sometimes assigns a gender, masculine or feminine, to something that in English we would consider neuter. So for example, a tree is feminine, a book is masculine, a ship, hand, etc. all have genders that we would consider them neuter. So you might say the tree which, not the tree who, right? Even though it's going to have the feminine gender in Latin. Okay, so strategies for translating relative clauses. Follow these 4 strategies, these 4 steps, okay? Here is a sentence that has a relative clause in it. Femina quam laudas est sapiens, okay? The first thing you want to do is identify your relative pronoun and your relative clause. From there, you should figure out the gender number in case of your pronoun because that's going to help you find your antecedent. Step 2, you find your antecedent. In step 3, I have you translate everything but the subordinate clause, the relative clause, figure out what the main sentence says. And then step 4, you translate the relative clause immediately after your antecedent. So let's look at this example, femina quam laudas est sapiens, and follow the rules or follow the steps. We identify quam as our relative pronoun, and we identify quam laudas, so relative pronoun and a verb. That's what you need for a relative clause. You can have more, but this one doesn't. We've identified those as our relative clause, okay? I even made it a different color, bracketed it off and made it a different color. The gender number case of quam, feminine singular accusative. Now, we know that quam gets its gender and its number from its antecedent. So feminine and singular, what's the only feminine singular thing we have in here? Femina. Whoop. So our antecedent is femina. Okay. Now, if we follow the next step, we translate the main sentence. So quam laudas is our relative clause, but we want to translate the main clause. Femina est sapiens. The main clause translates as the woman is wise. And then we want to translate the quam laudas immediately after its antecedent, femina. The woman, quam, whom, because it's the direct object of laudas, whom you praise, est sapiens, is wise. There you go. That's how you translate a sentence with a relative clause in it. One last thing. Sometimes the antecedent to a relative pronoun can be the pronoun subject in a verb, right? It can be the he, she, or it that you get from a verb. Again, keep following the same steps that we just identified. So our sentence example for this is going to be sapiens est qui multos libros legit. Okay, let's follow our steps. The first thing we want to do is identify our relative clause. It's introduced by qui, okay? It has the verb legit, and actually this particular relative clause has a direct object, okay? Qui is nominative singular masculine, so its antecedent is going to be the he in est, okay? The he in est. So if we translate the main sentence first, sapiens est, he is wise, and then we understand that we have to translate the relative clause after the he in the est. So he, qui, who reads multos libros, many books. So he who reads many books is wise. Okay. We'll have some practice with this on Monday. I hope you have a really good weekend. See you then.